Welcome to a very special Narrative Live. You might be able to tell that I'm doing a little bit more stuff at 7 p.m. at night because it's a good time slot. And there's less of us around, which means more of you can watch us. And Patrick Lovell is back this week. You met him last week in part of the very interesting Greatest Heists talk that we did for paid subscribers. But he's back today for a very different reason. And hey, Patrick, how are you today?
I'm well, Zev. How are you?
I'm good. Busy is a good word for me today. It has been a really busy day, but it's been so productive and lots of great content and discovering new things. And I'm really excited to have you on because, this Saturday, as everyone knows, No Kings will be a big protest march or marches across the country. Maybe 5 million people might show up. Maybe 10 million people might show up. Who knows? It's certainly going to be one of the largest demonstrations we've ever had in America, especially as the climate around the Trump regime gets even more heated every day. Now, even though it's a large number, most of the experts tell me that it's not actually enough to just do one day of protesting. That's just not enough. What you really need is 3.5% of the population showing up on a sustained basis, staying active, organized, and being really relentless about getting it all done. And the other thing that people talk to me about No Kings, which is a bit of a challenge, is that it's kind of, it's like milk toast. It's very generic. There's lots of nice big ideas, but there's no real policy involved in all of it. And that's where you come in because you're proposing something really unique on Saturday. You're proposing a sort of a new plan, a new policy proposal that you call the New Clean Deal. And you're going to tell us all about it tonight. We're going to hear a lot about that, this group of experts you have called the Untouchables. And I really like it because I think that there is something unique in what you're suggesting, even though it's pretty specific and might be hard to get done. I will say that. It's a very exciting idea that there's actual vision being put around what we want to do the day after the Trump regime is gone. And hopefully that day comes sooner rather than later. So let me turn it over to you and ask you the first question. Yeah, what is the New Clean Deal?
Well, it's the Clean New Deal. And if
sorry.
you don't mind, I'm going to riff just briefly on this point first, because first of all, thank you for saying what you said, Zeb, because look, man, I think what we should do is start with your new Untouchables first, because if we backdoor into the Clean New Deal, it'll make more sense to your viewers from this perspective. So you identify something that I've been using in my dialogue recently, that the leadership, unfortunately, of the national No Kings movement is milk toast. Now, I can't believe you said that because I haven't heard anybody else say that, but it shows that you and I are once again completely on the same page. I mean, it's like, telepathically, we speak the same language. And the indivisible operation who's responsible for the organization of the No Kings rally is led by a couple who I think are incredibly intelligent. Most people know by their first names, Ezra and Leah, and they are located in Washington, D.C. within the Beltway. And these two are folks that are kind of remind me of myself a little bit when I was coming up in the world. They're political scientists that specifically work on campaigns and data management and dealing with absolute details of all of the different sorts of parameters of whatever that campaign may be. So they're really, really experts at aggregating where different, let's just say hot points may or may not be, right? Now, it's interesting that you said the actual movement itself is relatively milquetoast, because we have seen just the opposite from Stephen Miller, from Mike Johnson, from, of course, Pam Bondi, and on down the line, where they're waging war on America through a concept called Antifa, anti-fascism. I mean, wasn't that the entirety of the United States military and really much North American Command and D-Day and everything that we understand about fighting?
Yeah, we've been anti-fascist for a while. This is not news, nor is it terrorism.
Right, but you and I both know that, and I think this is really important to at least acknowledge from this standpoint. What they're, from the propaganda side, I maybe I proposed this to you for your interaction, but you and I both know for decades and decades, we've seen through the conflicts in Israel, particularly in the West Bank and, of course, Gaza, we've seen Palestinians throw rocks by the thousands, right? And we also saw in Seattle in 1998, we've seen far left groups basically use similar tactics, covered in masks and that sort of thing, to make their point, regardless of whatever that situation, that date. And we could talk about all the details that led to those, but that's not the point of what I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is that when whoever's behind the scenes, the technocrats, those folks were aware of that, and what they're trying to brand is what America's non compliance with a fascist, corrupt regime as being the same thing as what I just potentially painted the picture of, right? So it's a propaganda effect, right? And they have been on the offense for the last month and a half in the most outrageous ways I think anybody could ever imagine. We saw from the beginning of Charlie Kirk's funeral, where Stephen Miller literally had a proclamation that the left has no idea what's coming for them, that they've unleashed this righteous fury, that they have no idea. We'll go to the ends of the world to root this out, root and stem sort of thing, right? I mean, it's kind of cheesy, I hate to say. When I watch it, I think I'm looking at a cartoon
Well,
villain.
it's a plan, right? I mean, they clearly are trying to identify the other or the enemy in America. And as every other authoritarian movement has done in the world, they are pointing at the left leaning. If they're the right wing authoritarian government, they're pointing at the left wing. I mean, seen it as this reminds me of Lenin and the communists back, and the socialists back in the revolution in Russia. But on the other hand, it is happening. I mean, it may seem ludicrous, it may seem ridiculous, because on the face of it, none of this is really happening. There's no terrorism, there is no funding network, there is none of that that's happening out there. But they are still going to, make us all into villains. They're going to turn the left into the enemy and into combatant enemies. And that's what you're pointing out, is that they're arriving with war. They're arriving, fully loaded and ready to take on the left. And I'm concerned that the left is sort of, we'll march a little bit. We're going to march on a day and then we'll all go home. 10 million people will pour into the streets and they'll go home at the end of it with nice pictures and nice posters and maybe even great images that'll be, shot around the world. But will they actually achieve anything? And other than just a day of protest? And that's where my hope is that there's something in this notion of us actually thinking, what do we do the day after Trump regime is no longer there? How do we fix the big problems that we have in our society and in our government?
I'm going to give that all to you, but with one more point to this, in this crucial scenario. Let's paint. I mean, you're absolutely right about all of that, but we both know that Joseph Goebbels, his entire platform was create a big enough lie to where it overwhelms the system's ability to think critically about it, and then that's where the conformity comes in. We saw that through Nazi Germany. We understand exactly what this propaganda tactic is. But to your further point, the reaction, the resistance, the so-called, let's compare and contrast just briefly to a fictional depiction of Andor, right? Now, Andor, I don't recall, even though don't get me wrong, I love the brilliance of satire from those in Portland that are dressing up as the Frog, that are dressing up as Kenny from South Park. I love it, right? I think it's fantastic. But that's not a plan, right? We didn't see the dancing frogs in Andor going against the Empire. There was a network of resistance baked into working with what we know in any sort of conflict in the art of war. You got to understand the leverage and the ability and the choke points and so on and so forth. That's not the point of the dialogue. The point is, what are we going to do the day after? So getting back to what we've been doing with our the new Untouchables, which have grown out of our work called The Con, which people can find at thecon.tv. But I have been...
Well, let's explain what The Con is. The Con is a 5-part documentary series, and it's all about what happened in 2008, the crash that happened in 2008, and your own discovery afterwards as to why it happened, which was a giant fraud played on the American people. And in this documentary series available for free right now at thecon.tv, people can see all 5 episodes of how America was really defrauded during this period of time. And many people lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, and lost their futures. And it's from that you discovered the Untouchables.
That's right. tens of millions of people got set up that weren't just people who borrowed for their houses, pensions and counties and countries, and tens of millions of people around the world that led to tens of trillions of dollars that were backdoored to this billionaire apparatus, this global billion apparatus, where the fraud never ended. The con never ended. The con gave us Donald Trump. Don the Con's been playing this game. We could talk about Letitia James. We could talk about all elements of what's been going on that front. But the new Untouchables are made up of these folks that came out of the Department of Justice. They were regulators, they were prosecutors, they were state AGs. They're professionals and the leading legal experts in the country that come out of the most prestigious institutions in the United States, from the Ivy League, University of Michigan, Texas, Stanford, so on and so forth. And they spent decades in these positions to fight and counter corruption. Many people might recall the savings and loan crisis of the late 80s, early 90s.
You're frozen there a little bit, but I will wait for you to catch up. Definitely, they're back to us. There you go. Like,
That's one too.
Yeah, you're there. You're there now.
Okay.
And you're frozen again.
Maybe they're
keep going. Keep going. It's okay.
Signal.
It happens a lot lately.
Yeah, I bet. So the story of the savings and loan era was it was a ginormous racketeering effort that we call control fraud. There's a way it works. And Bill Black, William K. Black, who you've interviewed, was one of the leading investigators. He was the general counsel of what was known as the Office of Thrift Supervision. And he worked with this incredible array of guys that basically were nonpartisan. Some of them came out of the Reagan administration at the time. In fact, Ed Gray was one of Nancy Reagan's most trusted compatriots, and he had integrity. And so they turned the table on this massive conspiracy, and they were able to bring, honestly, they had $100 million budget at that time. So you can imagine how much that was to try to put this dragnet in play. This was back in 1983 initially, and it lasted a decade. But the sum total of what they did led to over 7,000 convictions of elite white-collar bankers, quite frankly. Now, contrast that with the 2008 great financial crisis. That was a $4.5 trillion housing bubble that became a $900 trillion global calamity. That was baked in CDOs and credit default swaps and all sorts of derivatives. But in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, how many executives went to prison?
0 went to prison because they didn't go after them. Let me just back up here a little bit. So you've assembled out of this documentary, you've got this group of legal minds that have been responsible for many, many years for regulating the system, basically regulating the financial system. So you've amassed all these experts, and you've called each other, or it's yourselves, the Untouchables. And basically, it's this group of legal minds, these people who know what they're looking for when they're looking for financial crimes, that are now proposing this clean new deal.
Well, yes. Okay. I'll get to that in a moment, but let me explain what we do the day after. Okay. So basically, these guys, in addition to what we talked about in the savings and loan crisis, they were also the masterminds behind the prosecutions of Enron, WorldCom, La Cosa Nostra, the largest international crime syndicate in money laundering. Really, the nation's top elite prosecutors and investigators that are tasked with breaking up giant racketeering rings, quite frankly, which have been on overdrive for the last 30 years. Obviously, your work, The Greatest Heist, reveals one of the biggest aspects of that, right? So what happened was they got kneecapped basically after the great financial crisis, because when the Obama administration came in, they played ball, they covered this whole thing up, and the next thing you know, we're on our way to all of the stuff that we're in the middle of, right? So what we have to do now is use the law that doesn't exist in the federal government. Because why? Because the Department of Justice is corrupt. The Supreme Court is completely corrupt. All of the appeals court in the federal system are corrupt, and the third district circuit court, so on and so forth. Because why? Because these technocrats in 2025 got their people in there, whether or not it's SCOTUS and the backdoor of what we know from Leonard Leo and all of the big money that went into it. So the way we're going to turn the tables on this monstrosity is twofold. First, we have been connected to the world's most prestigious whistleblower operation within the Beltway called the Government Accountability Project. They've been on top of all of the biggest scandals in the history of the United States going back to the 70s. This is where people who work within the system go to get representation to blow up whatever that fraud was at the time. They're affectionately known as whistleblowers. The most courageous people, typically they're nonpartisan. They're there to report injustices or crimes that are happening because they're professionals, quite frankly. So we have access to over 2,000 of them at the moment, okay? That are going to come out of the Department of Justice, the FBI, FEMA, air traffic control, you name it, across the board of the federal government. Okay. Now, to give you one example of something
that's breaking news in some ways. I mean, I don't know if people know that there are 2,000 government whistleblowers that are about to unleash themselves and tell the world what is going on. That is big breaking news.
And why is it that you're the one breaking it, Zev?
I don't know. Why am I the one breaking it?
Well, because we've got the likes of Larry Ellison that have taken over the corporate sponsored of what we saw with 60 Minutes. And you've got somebody like Leslie Stahl that's doing bidding for the likes of what we just saw last Sunday, when you've got somebody like the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink,
Schwartzman.
say,
sorry.
That was Blackstone. But Larry Fink said, oh, wait a second. We're going to we believe that now crypto is actually something that people can consider. I mean, this is the voice of the world's largest asset manager, to put it into perspective, right? So let me circle back why you're the guy breaking this news. Because you're the guy that wrote The Greatest Heist. You're the guy that came out of the mainstream media to go independent, to be able to find sources that are providing the information that people that watch you need to understand, because obviously the mainstream media is not telling it. Now, I do have a relationship with the New York Times, as you know, and we'll discuss that further. But moving forward through this operation, so the way this has to work, and we called for this immediately after the No Kings rally the first time in June, okay, that got 5 million plus. For example, William K. Black was calling at the top of his lungs that we've got to get the state legislatures to subpoena, at that time, Elon Musk. Why? Because Elon Musk just dropped the dime on Trump and said he's in the Epstein files. If state legislatures would have, because they have subpoena power, with the hearings, we could have gotten the whistleblowers and revealed all that Elon Musk knew at that time. That was 4 months ago. Go ahead.
Yeah. So state legislators can do that. They can actually bring in the drop subpoena powers, and they're enforceable federally, or they're just enforceable in that state.
In that state, but that's the point, because because like I said, the DOJ is completely corrupt. The Supreme Court is completely corrupt. They've got complete ownership of the entirety of our legal system that is now completely corrupt. Let's not forget, IGs were fired. IGs were they bailed. All of the honest people that worked in all of the different agencies, they left by the thousands. Did they not? Like several months ago? Maybe it was more like that, close. I mean, I don't know what the exact.
Some of them are leaving now, but there's a lot of people leaving. So let me ask you back up a little bit here. So you mentioned The Greatest Heist. The Greatest Heist is something I wrote about, the Epstein and Trump saga, and it looks back over 40 years of what looks like one big criminal conspiracy to basically steal the American economy, to destroy capitalism from within. And it ties in a lot with the work you've done at the con, and it certainly ties in with why you're proposing such a comprehensive review of everything that we have relating to fraud and fraud detection and our banking system and all of that. Now, this is actually really boring stuff for most people. Most people, when they think about, how are we going to change the world, they're not really interested in, how are we going to recreate, this bill or that bill that, controls big banks from being too big to fail. But actually, that is your proposal. And that's why it's, I think, quite ideal, because what's happened is we've had 40 years of criminal activity going on, organized criminal activity that has basically targeted everyday Americans and stolen their futures, stolen their homes, stolen their dreams, stolen their kids' graduations and their schooling, and has stolen all the things, everything encompassing the American dream has really been taken away from many, many Americans because of the ultra wealthy group of organized criminals who have basically defrauded America. And so the proposals you're suggesting are very, very smart, because they redress that issue that we have in our system, that we no longer have regulators that go after people who commit fraud at the highest levels, which is why in 2008 no one was charged. And we need to have that. If you're not going to hold people accountable for crimes, don't even call them crimes. If you're going to, and maybe that's what we've done. We've just said, hey, let the criminals run everything. And maybe that's what's going on right now. But
that's exactly what's going on right now.
If we are going to have crimes, and we need teeth, and we need to be able to go after those people and put them behind bars so they don't commit those crimes. It sounds kind of really obvious as I'm saying it, but you know what I'm saying. So tell me, if we can get to this, if we can get to the clean, so what are you actually proposing? Because I think there's so many good points to this.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Now, I'll just rip through this because I know we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to finish up on the new Untouchables right now with the No Kings rally. We need to get millions of people to understand we have professionals in the system. Look, if you wanted to win the Super Bowl, you want to have Tom Brady as your quarterback. You want to win the NBA championship, wouldn't be a bad idea to have Michael Jordan on your team. Same with you want to win an NHL, Stanley Cup, back in the day. I'm using all 80s references and whoever will win, but they've got all the crowns, whatever. I know sports isn't your biggest thing, but the analogy is most people.
I get the analogies.
Right, yeah. Because Bill Black is that guy, as are all the people that we have. And that's the reason I do talk to the New York Times. That's why I do have a lot of, credibility with all of the people that are at the top level of the system, because they know that I am carrying around the $71 trillion truth. What does that mean, the $71 trillion truth? You know the $41 trillion truth, and then we can talk about the $70 trillion truth. It sounds overwhelming to people because why? There's 1,000 billion and a trillion. What are you talking about, the $71 trillion truth? That's how much these billionaires have looted. Well, most people are asleep at the switch with their head in the sand, not understanding how the country works over the course of the last 14 years, that have complete control of every apparatus of government as well as media. Does that make sense? So this is how you fix it. You got to ask 4 questions, okay? So please interrupt anytime you have a question. But the United States is supposed to be a democracy, even though a lot of people call it a constitutional republic and so forth. The nuances matter. But the idea is, I think most of us accept or think that the law is equal, that we have a dynamic playing field. That's fair. That's the idea of what the notion of capitalism and democracy from 2 different pockets enable us to have freedom of liberty of movement to make choices. Okay, in so many words, that's what it is ideologically, right? It's all nonsense. It's a lie. So you have to ask yourself 4 questions first and foremost. What is qualified immunity? What is presidential immunity? What is judicial immunity? And ultimately, what is the Electoral College? When you understand those 4 questions, and I hate to sound like Passover, why is this night different from all other nights? But when you understand the rudimentary manipulation of power, you understand the perversion of power. You understand how the minority can control the majority when the majority is asleep at the switch. So we've created the precepts of the Clean New Deal to basically, because I studied political science, I studied journalism, I understand our system. I am a bit of a technocrat. If I was a bad guy, you might call me Russell Vogt, but I'm a good guy, so call me Patrick Lovell, and I've got the Clean New Deal, and I know exactly how to kick these guys in a place that'll make their toupees fly off their head. And we do so by the following 9 points. Number 1.
I don't know. There you are. You're back. You're back.
Did I freeze?
You did. You're freezing occasionally. I'm told it's just on my side, so maybe people at home can see you properly. But either way, right now, you're unfrozen, so keep going.
Okay, thank you. So number 1, we've got to create a new Glass-Steagall Act. What that means is we have to, as a superpower, which we're a descending death spiral, whatever the hell we are, 3rd world country. But if you want to get back to rebooting the American dream in all of its facets, 1, you got to start with the money. Is money the most important lifeblood of what our economy is? Absolutely. It's a rhetorical question. So you have to understand money. You have to understand corruption. But in lieu of time, I'll explain in one simple way that we can create aligned interest. We have to recreate Glass-Steagall. What does that mean? After the Great Depression, we created the Glass-Steagall Act because the people that investigated what created the Great Depression realized that the guys who were in control of everybody's money were setting everybody up in a massive Ponzi scheme using outsized leverage and many other technical things, right? So what they determined was you've got to have capital as the lifeblood of the system. However, you have to have integrity of the system and you have to have an alliance of interest. You can't have commercial banking where we all put our paychecks so that we can go out to eat, that we can manage our monthly expenses and so on and so forth. You can't combine that to allow the powers that be within those institutions to gamble with other people's money. Those are the three most dangerous letters in finance, to basically use investment banking to do over-leveraged, highly derivatives and all sorts of tricks of the trade that we call financial innovation. But is just basically, a three-dimensional chess, 26-dimensional chess, whatever game you want to understand that you don't understand how it works, and you're on the menu. It's called predatory capitalism, okay? And when you allow them to gamble with your money, eventually they're going to blow up everything. That's what these pump and dump schemes and things that you obviously point out with, of course, the greatest heist and so forth. But when you have those two financial apparatuses separated, first and foremost, you don't risk the economy by people taking risks, which is supposedly capitalism, right? But the people that are supposed to be taking the risks are supposed to understand the businesses they're taking the risks on, and they're not supposed to be gambling three-dimensional chess where they're taking fees to destroy you. But here's the ultimate caveat to the whole thing. What we did after the 2008 great financial crisis, which takes me back to the $71 trillion truth, is we unleashed the Federal Reserve to backdoor tens of trillions of dollars illegally to this global racketeering enterprise. And anybody with a right mind would know that there's no one in the world that's a professional that's in the system would allow that to happen, unless, of course, they didn't think anybody else would ever find out what happened. That's what we did. And I could go on and on about that. But
so what happened to the Glass-Steagall Act? It was repealed, in the 2000s or around then?
No. 1994-ish. 1998 is when it happened. It was during the Clinton administration, but it was part and parcel. And by the way, this is a very important question. So Russell Vogt got his start being a low man on the totem pole. I'm trying to think of the right word of who he worked for, but he worked for a guy by the name of Phil Gramm out of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Phil Gramm. Senator Phil Gramm is responsible for what you just asked. He was the guy that got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act because they wanted to create supermarket banking, because they understood that you could create all of these incredible, games of deception where the banks, are basically freed up to take fees. And then they do this provocatively every 10 years. They mask it as a business cycle, and then they get paid back on the bailout. Okay. It was the Greenspan put in the late 90s. Sorry to be a little technical and talk really fast, but the long and the short of it is, it just simply means that you cannot, the way I'm proposing a new Glass-Steagall Act, because it literally says this in the statutes. This was written back in 1933. You can't gamble on commodities, particularly real estate, because that's what created the Great Depression. That's what Senator Glass and Senator Steagall knew then, and that's who they knew how to align interests. So what I'm saying now is we've got to create a new Glass-Steagall, but with the caveat.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
We literally have to write that you cannot use the full faith and the credit of the United States to guarantee racketeering. It's that simple. That's the first precept.
So just to explain to everyone, we got out of 1929. We got the stock market crash. They come up, the smart legislators at the time come up with the Glass-Steagall Act, which is designed to stop 1929 crashes from happening. It is the law for 70 years or so, I guess. And then in 1999, Graham, Leach, and Bailey basically repealed that thing. And then we get set up for 2008, which is this huge run on our financial system that leaves us, 40 trillion, 50, whatever it is, $trillion in debt. Now, that is remarkable.
No. They gave the system 70 trillion. That did give us, well, you could parlay that into that's why the debt is, but it's different. There's different.
Yeah.
But yeah, we literally
it's important.
We gave 300,000 people over $70 trillion, roughly. Okay. That's what Wall Street is. But it's the billionaire apparatus that has complete control. We're in agreement on that, right? We all know that. This is how.
They were Republicans, weren't they?
Well, no, it was everybody. It was Democrat. It was Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon's, and by the way, well, I don't want to go into it too much, but please continue with your questions, and I'll move on to the
Okay,
next.
I understand why. Okay, so no, I'm listening to the four key elements of the deal that you're proposing. So one is clearly about Glass-Steagall. What's the rest?
So we got to get rid of dark money in politics. Just ask anybody who was a victim of P. Diddy's freak off if anything good happens in the shadows. That's Citizens United. That's just legal corruption. If you can be in the back shadows, not good things are going to happen. So those are two sides of the same coin. The third precept of the Clean New Deal is, and I need everybody to hear me. Please, please hear me. Because those of us who believe in a progressive society and a society that's dynamic and a society that can solve big problems, most of us get hung up on the fact if we ask the question, where are we going to get the money for that? Where are we going to get the money? I'm telling you right now, you got to understand fiat currency. You got to understand global dynamics of the dollar being the world's reserve currency. And there's a lot of other things. And without getting an economics degree, all you really need to know is that we gave $71 trillion illegally to this den of thieves that gave us Trump. It's that simple. So if you want to live in a fascist empire where nobody gets to know what's going on and live under the chokehold of the fossil fuel, dirty fuel industry that's destroying the world, please, by all means, ignore me. But if you understand that as a starting point, $71 trillion, our GDP is $25 trillion. There's a notion of productive capacity. After the Great Depression, we had public-private works projects that rebuilt, for example, Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge. And then after World War II, the intercontinental highways. Those are all part of the mechanisms of the federal government investing in the actual economy, which is the real economy. So if we want to re-engineer the middle class of the United States, where robber barons don't have complete control, we got to stop them from extracting tens of trillions of dollars illegally to use against us. But then we need to reconfigure the economy so that, for example, redeveloping a renewable energy paradigm in the United States and around the world, quite frankly, would create so much productive capacity that we wouldn't even think about those terms, because we've got to rebuild the world, and we probably should have done it back in 1990 something is when we started this project. But we've been living in the aftermath of this robber baron, mob mentality for now decades. And it's the end of the line. It's the end of democracy. It's the end of free markets. It's the end of the law. And we can all see it right in front of our face. But we can turn the tables if we use the Clean New Deal to do that. And we can also bring a lot of us out of our silos. If you want to get rid of systemic racism in prisons, if you want to, have a renewable energy paradigm, better education, better healthcare, all of those types of things, better relationships with our friends to the north. My God, we got to get Trump out of there, but then we got to get the billionaire apparatus of robber barons out of there. And we do that by the next 4 points. We end qualified immunity. We end judicial immunity, particularly in the Supreme Court. We end, of course, presidential immunity, and then we overturn the Electoral College, which is just pure manipulation. And I could go into that all day, every day.
All of it sounds great, but to overturn the Electoral College, don't you have to write a new constitution?
Which is why we have to have a movement of people that have said enough. Why? Because we have no time. I just read this last week, and I'll pose this to you, and you tell me, right? So we've got, again, all of these incredible scientists all over the world telling us that we're on the verge of the no. And we've been saying this for some time, but we have been, right? So the reefs, the ecosystems, the oceans, they're warming to such an incredible, degree that we're not even going to be able to inhabit the planet unless we get a hold of, obviously, global warming, which is the entire paradigm, right? First and foremost. But second, it's like, okay, guys, what are we going to do? Sit back and let Donald Trump, who I believe has got a capital flow north of $5 to $10 billion with a net of about $3.4 billion in ill-gotten gains over the course of the last 9 months, while he's doing what? Shutting down the government, giving $20 billion to the likes of Argentina and all of the fraud that's involved with that. Guys, we're living through the mother lode of the consequence of not holding bad guys to account, which is the law. And that's what this Clean New Deal and the new Untouchables will achieve, but it has to be a paradigmatic change. All of those loopholes, all of those clever inside the system's opacity to basically lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate and deceive you is what we've got to shine a light on to create uber transparency. But it has to come from a movement that is not going to tolerate corruption. And that's how this Clean New Deal, like if your example, final point on this whole thing, because there's two points. Look, I'm sure everybody like me every day wakes up and goes, wait, here's another day where this RICO president, that's a pedophile racketeer or protection ring, is unleashing troops throughout the United States, waging war on other countries, all of these horrific things that are taking place, and nobody can stop him. Nobody can stop him. I'll tell you how we stop him. We get the new Untouchables in the state legislatures with the subpoena power to bring these cases, to bring all of these things to the American people and use state law. And also, by the way, one of the major caveats of this is in the bar association. Once you set these lying inept attorneys of the DOJ that's all that's left are people who lie that work for Pam Bondi. Once they step into a court of law that is not completely corrupt, they will be made clear, and then they will step on their own lies and become disbarred. That's another part of this.
So you just to recap here, you mentioned the Glass-Steagall, you mentioned Citizens United, you mentioned the Electoral College. That's a big one because I don't think you can do that unless you have a constitutional convention, and I think that is complicated. But the first two you can do. The first two seem really doable. Is there another point is there another one that I'm missing on the four?
There's two more. We've got to get, but you gotta understand, look, I come from brand management initially, right? You got to think big. You've got to think,
yes.
how are you going to create a network? How do you build a global multinational corporation? You think in paradigms. That's what we do. That's what I've done my entire career. I know exactly how this stuff works. And there's a lot of very smart people in the system. The problem is we've got too much dark money that is poisoning good people who otherwise would be on the right side of this if they themselves weren't corrupt. That's a big part of it when you legalize corruption. So you take out the ability to legalize corruption, and then you create an economy of by and for the people and a government of by and for the people. Is it idealistic? I don't know, any more so than what a bunch of, we'll call them landed gentry, but turning the tables through the Tea Party on the biggest empire in the history of the world that started a revolution that gave us what? The Bill of Rights 13 years later and the Constitution. So we would never have kings. So do I think that it's going to be a hard grind? Yeah, it's the righteous grind. But what's the consequence? What's the consequence? If we don't do this, if we don't cleanse the pollution of corruption and understand that we've given $71 trillion illegally to these bad guys, what chance do we have to turn the tables?
Well, all of it is very important, and most people would agree with all of it. The thing that I like the most about it is that at least it's an attempt to put a framework around what can happen the day after. Because we're talking a lot about, every day in the news, we follow what Donald Trump's agenda is because he is so good at lighting us up, and we follow the news that he wants us to follow. And there's very few people talking about, well, what are we going to replace this with? We all can see that we're in a corrupt mess. I mean, almost every American must be able to see that by now, that this man is enriching himself to the tune of $10 billion based on his cryptocurrency holdings, that he's making deals with foreign nations that give him access to our resources, that give him access to our know-how. He's got these tariffs, which are hurting Americans, will end up costing us a ton of money as an economy. One imagines down the line, hasn't really done that so far, but down the line, it will impact all the prices. And on top of that, it just seems like we no longer have the value system that we all know is American. So everyone can see that. That is why 10 million people are going to show up on Saturday. And what this does is it gives them a bit of a framework to think about, well, okay, say we actually achieve our goal here and Donald Trump is no longer in power. We can't just go back to the old system. We actually have to replace it with something new, or at least something that repairs the mistakes of the previous system. And that's what I like about this. Even if not every of it is, I don't think all of it can be implemented. I don't think a constitutional convention can actually achieve a result because there's so much polarization. But I do think that the ideas behind the restoring the Glass-Steagall Act and restoring, repairing it, and or something different that looks like it, and regulating the corruption. I mean, we have had runaway corruption in America for the last 50, 60 years. And it's killing us. When we look at that massive debt number, it's there because of cycle after cycle of crashes, of people running up the markets and then crashing them and then stealing the bailout money and then buying the distressed assets at a good price at the end of it. That is corruption on top of corruption on top of corruption. And then nothing changes because all the politicians are completely bought up by the same corporations. It's all so corrupt, it makes you go crazy. But we can change that. We can change that if we think about what are we going to give them the day after. And I think just in terms of people's minds, to think that there is an alternative to MAGA, there is an alternative to Donald Trump, there is an alternative to what's happening right now. We can build it because that's what the Constitution of America says. Is our government, supposedly. So let us figure out what it is that we need to do to fix up the next day, the day after Donald Trump leaves office. And, we'll look forward to that day.
Two more points that I haven't been able to say yet. Okay, so we have to get 13 justices on the Supreme Court to balance out the Roberts Court. Okay, how are you going to do that? Well, you got to be just as committed as Mitch McConnell and the Republicans were, So that's just the lay of the land. And finally, you got to end inside trading by our Congress. That is just pure, insane corruption. If you're creating bills for budgets and this and that, you can't be profiting from that because then it's like you're just completely separate from why you're there in the first place, which creates this toxic deception and this propaganda and this mess that we're in. Yeah, look, friends, in closing, Zev was brilliant in his response to that. And I thank you, Zev, because you're the real deal. You've been down this path. You've been fighting the good fight. You know how to get inside and in sync. Your work with the greatest heist shows the other side, the composite of what it is that I'm revealing to you guys. But the fact of the matter is that this has been a war on all of us. This has been a war fostered by the worst of the worst villains of hypocrisy, duplicity, and outright deception, which means we've all been getting played. They've just been pissing on our heads, telling us it's rain. What I'm revealing to you is what we all knew on the schoolyard, or if you've got brothers and sisters. One game we play in the United States back in the day that I think is a really good metaphor is capture the flag. You hide the flag. There's deception. Everybody's got to figure out what it is, and people have to be complicit in hiding the flag. That's what these guys have done, but they've gotten paid billions to the smartest people in the world to be able to lie to us. And this is the result. And they've gotten away with it now, like you said, for 50 years. But I promise you, after 2008, in fact, just so people understand, Zev is right about the corruption lasting as long as it's had. But never in the history of the United States, or the world for that matter, that I'm aware of. I bet you maybe the English crown after some wars in the Middle Ages probably to this effect pulled it off because they could because of their central bank. But nowhere in no time in the United States did we even come close to the amount of exigent lending to the tune of tens of trillions of dollars. Most people think of it as quantitative easing. That was one part of it. That came after the initial 33 trillion. And then there was another giant infusion of capital in 2019 that came from the run on SoftBank in Japan that was based on the repo market. That's just all highly technical stuff, right? Just trust me when I say, my friends, that like the great George Carlin said, it's a big club and you're not in it. We've got to gather around truth tellers. We got to gather around. Look, last point that I want to make, because I think people do respond to this. When you get on a plane, you expect there to be a professional flying the plane. If you saw a bunch of guys that were in the bar getting drunk, falling down, having a strip dancer do whatever they're doing, and then all of a sudden you saw those guys get in the cockpit, you'd probably get off that plane as quickly as possible. Every day I look at this monstrosity of these inept, moronic idiots in the Trump cabinet and the presidency. That's what I see. They're flying the 747 USA into the frickin' ground, and we're all on board. It's time to take over the cockpit. We join each other. We get this thing to soar and say adios to the bad guys.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. What a fantastic idea you have. I really support most of it, some of it, maybe not all of it. And I just think it's fantastic that this Saturday you're going to get an opportunity to present some of this at the No Kings rally. Tell everyone where they can see you, how it'll come to pass, and we'll try carry it narrative as well.
That would be great. Well, look, I've got a YouTube channel, Patrick Lovell, Truth Bombs the Con. I also have a YouTube channel with the new Untouchables. I'd encourage everybody to check out. Please check out our work at thecon.tv. And then also, please check out thecleannewdeal.org. And I'll ask you, as a passing question here, Zeb, you don't agree with all of it, or do you not think it's possible?
I agree with almost all of it. I don't think it's possible to get everyone around a table and rewrite the Constitution. I think it's asking for, it's just a challenge that we're not really sure what's going to come out on the other end of it, and it may not be that good. I know that's not very positive thinking, and I know I like you thinking about a new paradigm. I'm just really concerned that the basics of our government being taken over by dark money is absolutely the core issue. Right. The fact that we've had this runaway corruption and this runaway criminal activity happening is the problem. Without that problem, we'd have a far more sophisticated economy right now. We would have wealthier people, to the tune of millions of dollars. Each of us would be much richer if this corruption, if this crime spree that started in the Iran-Contra and is carried on until today didn't exist. And that is the problem. It's the crimes, and there'd be no accountability. And from that regard, everything you're saying in terms of Glass-Steagall and everything else, I think you're spot on about that. And Citizens United, those things are not, they're sort of antithetical to democracy. They don't really belong.
The tumor of the problem is corruption. And if you don't, if you don't nuke the tumor with, radiation, chemo, whatever, you don't fix the problem, it metastasizes. Mm-hmm. That's been the last 50 years. But you're absolutely right. But I do look forward to future dialogue, because I would like to take the Clean New Deal point by point, and I'd love for you to challenge me on each and every one of them at the appropriate time. But man, I am so grateful to be, in your world and working together forward on solutions to massive problems, because I haven't come across anyone that I think has a more thorough understanding of corruption, quite frankly, than you, outside of the group that I've been with for some time.
I'm sure there's plenty of people who do that, but thank you very much. I really appreciate your comments, and I really appreciate you, Patrick. I appreciate the con and all your efforts, which are incredibly, guided by principle and good values, and that's always very important. Someone sent me the song, which I hadn't heard for a while. I don't know if you're a Leonard Cohen fan. First paragraph. This is yeah. So let's take a listen to this one thing, just because it's just one stanza of this thing, but it's good. If I can play it. Do you remember the song? Everybody knows.
Everybody knows that the days are loaded.
I do.
Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. Everybody knows the fight was fixed. The poor stay poor. The rich get rich. That's how it goes. Everybody knows.
Which is basically the truth. Everybody does know the system seems awfully rigged right now. It seems like we're in the tail end of a huge corruption scandal that's taking down America. But maybe we could stop it with your work and everyone else's work. I hope everyone marches peacefully and with great intention this Saturday. We'll cover it here on Narrative. And I want to wish you all a very good night. And thank you, Patrick. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do, my man. Talk to you soon.
Okay. And the links to all your stuff will be in the story just below this piece once it's up on the site. So have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. All the best to you. Take care.